Hello everybody and welcome, and my apologies for lateness in starting this meeting. Now it would be good to know who's present. So I have got, if I could just have the board members identify themselves, and so I've got Dame Paula Rebstock, Dr. Jim Mather, Mary Jane Daly. I had a recent meeting with the chair of Greater Wellington, the Regional Council, who also chairs the Regional Transport Committee, which is a statutory committee established under the Land Transport Management Act, and they actually meet every 6 weeks in that role, and essentially it is, I would say, is really the AT board, a combination of AT board. And the Statutory Land Transport Committee functions are pretty much rolled into one when they have those meetings. And so I was just interested in really the relative power of the Regional Transport Committee in Wellington, who have very active discussions with various councils and with the government with that particular hat on, rather than their Greater Wellington hat. And so obviously, and that may well be the case with Canterbury as well, which of course is a very large public transport provider, although pretty a minnow compared to Greater Wellington and Auckland. So we're our own beast in Auckland.
Okay, Adrian Perry's just arrived, so.
Thank you and welcome, Perry. I think we're going to hear from you a little bit later. I've got various board members here. I'm Adrian Young-Cooper. I'm the chair of Auckland Transport and the chair of the Regional Transport Committee. In the terms of our charter, we've got Kylie Clegg, Dame Paula Rebstock, Dr. Jim Mathers, Mary Jane Daly, Wayne Donnelly is present with you, as is Darren Linton. So I think that's the board, and there are various executives who I would take it that you are familiar with. So welcome to your first meeting. You're the delegate of KiwiRail, who are a statutory member of the RTC. So we have got, I don't think we've got any apologies. We have our interest register as set out, and we have our, are there any changes to those interests? No. Is there anything on today's agenda that anybody wants to declare a conflict of interest in? Thank you. So let's now move to the Regional Transport Committee Charter. I take it that's just there for noting.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. Let's now move on to the development of the Regional Land Transport Plan 2021-2031.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Hamish, do you want to start with what this paper is trying to achieve? Thanks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The RTC, the Regional Transport Committee, has statutory responsibility for preparing and consulting on the draft RLTP and lodging that draft with the Auckland Transport Board for approval. This is the first meeting of the RTC for this next RLTP, and this paper is really to introduce the requirements and the board timelines and some of the decision points of related processes as part of the development of that RLTP process. In particular, the paper notes that the relationship with the long-term plan, the Council's long-term plan in terms of the funding, in terms of the regional fuel tax. It comments on the relationship with ATAP, which will inform the RLT program, but it's for the but it doesn't. So, but it is for the Regional Transport Committee to make its decisions, and also the relationship with the KiwiRail program, which is new in process this time, where the KiwiRail program will be included, or must be included in the Regional Land Transport program, and it is not actually part of the prioritisation process for the Regional Transport Committee. So the paper sets out these 3 areas, the requirements of the RLTP, the broad timelines and the decision points in terms of those related processes.
Did you want to make any other comments about the paper?
No, if I take it as read and take any questions on it.
Okay, questions from the board, please.
Well, you raised some good questions at the start of the last meeting, Madam Chair, about clarity about what the Regional Land Transport Committee can or can't do under this process in terms of prioritisation, and what we all have a sense that certain things that the government might want to achieve, for example, under ATAP, may completely reprioritise what we might want to do as the Transport Authority for Auckland, and how do we cope with that difference of view. So I think that's probably a further discussion to have in the context of this framework we should have set up for that.
I think other board members will have interesting views on this. I think it's critical that we prioritise our projects on the basis of the evidence base that we're able to do through the development of program business cases, complying with the investment model, and we can readily show how projects prioritise through one SIV, and then of course how they will prioritise through another. We actually had a pretty good example of that today with the safety program, and I think there are ways for us to have transparency while also having a regional land transport program which is deliverable. But the question I've got is the regional land transport program is essential in the right prioritisation to attract funding from the National Land Transport Program. That is driven by the kind of disciplines I've just described, and I want to understand what happens if ATAP has got quite a different prioritisation than we know will succeed through the RLTP connecting properly to the National Land Transport Program. How do we deal with that issue? It's the same as a similar version to what you've asked, Wayne.
Yeah, so I'll start with that one. Firstly, on the prioritisation process, can I indicate that we have worked hard with the ATAP to try and get alignment between the processes as much as we can. So in the sense that ATAP, for instance, have the 5 priority outcomes of growth, climate change, road choice, better connections, and safety. That's the 5th one. But they've got those same objectives. We've also developed a prioritisation framework which we've used to advise ATAP, and ATAP has used that to some extent within its prioritisation process. So we have tried to align the prioritisation as much as possible. There is a possibility that ATAP moves away or has a different program than what the RTC might recommend. And to me, it seems to me that it's likely to flow into two key things. One is that the NL or the GPS does refer to ATAP, and so it does give some status to ATAP. And so if we were to move away from the ATAP package, we should be aware of that. Secondly, in terms of activity classes in the NLTF, will be aligned at least with the last ATAP, and so again, it's got some particular implications that we'd have to work through. The other thing that I would sort of highlight is that not only do we have an alignment with the NLTP, but we've also got an alignment with the Council on the Regional Fuel Tax, and the Regional Fuel Tax defines a large amount of our program. So by a large amount, I should say about 45–50% of the last RLTP. So it was a large part of our discretionary program. And so we do have an issue of how we align with ATAP, but also to the extent that ATAP flows into the Council's Regional Fuel Tax program, we'd have to be aware of how that flowed into the Regional Land Transport Plan as well. So there's like a few sets of things in here, which seem to me that indicate that with where we are with the RTP, it is about trying to align as much as possible with the RTP, with the NLTP, and with the Council's regional fuel tax program. And both of those are certainly going to be informed by the ATAP program.
Really, to build on that, there are multiple processes at play here, and we're working at the moment on how to map out the decisions that each of those processes and decision makers need to make, and what the conversations need to be to support those decisions all the way through to next June. So we really are clear. Your earlier comment in the previous meeting, Madam Chair, about whose decisions are whose and for what for, I think is really important that we understand that and we're clear on that with you, so you can get a sense of how we're lining all those things up. Because we don't want to be in a position where we're scrambling to get you information and we're just not clear on who's making decisions about what and when.
Okay, just in terms of process, a couple of things. I don't recall seeing any prioritisation proposals before the Regional Transport Committee, and I don't recall seeing the adopted criteria and how they're going to be measured. And I don't, so the extent to which the RLTP can inform ATAP and the Council's fuel tax program, I don't recall seeing that, but that may have come to the board, and my memory mightn't be serving me well. Could you just remind us how we have, what has already been approved with respect to the framework for the RLTP, particularly the evaluation and prioritisation?
Right, so in terms of material that we brought to the board, we brought the objectives to the board around February, and they have evolved a little bit, and we've still got a process of aligning those objectives. But we brought those to the board, not for formal sign-off, but to inform the board at that time. In terms of the prioritisation framework, no, we haven't brought that to the board, and it's something that we have to do in terms of how we generally prioritise within the RLTP process.
What's the program for that?
And Chair, in terms of the program, what I'd like in the next period is to present, because the board talked about targets or wanted information on targets, about what the targets are, what the current program is in terms of the package of options that we've got in front of us, and some aspects around the current performance of the network. Then to also confirm basically the objectives and the prioritisation framework building on from that. That will then lead into, I think, an understanding of how the ATAP package has been developed and what feedback the RTC can provide on that package. So I would like certainly those first 2 points, the board to be, I think it would have to be earlier than that. We actually have to do that over October, because you can imagine that the ATAP packages will be developed over October, and that means that they'll be seeking perhaps board feedback if there's an opportunity to provide that feedback, board feedback in November. So that means that almost by the end of October, it would be useful if the board, or the RTC at least, were in a position to be informed about the program, the prioritisation.
Madam Chair, there's a lot of input comes into the RLTP. So you've got the GPS, which is decided by the Minister. You've got ATAP, which is decided by the Council and the Minister, the Mayor and the Minister, the Council and the Minister. You've got NZTA as the State Highway Authority. KiwiRail have their own rail development plan. And then you've got the Department of Conservation, obviously have things they want to do. So really what the Regional Transport Committee needs is a clear statement from AT about what it needs funding for and the reasons why. So that input at least should address the needs of the Auckland network, putting aside all those other things so that there is another view of the world. Because otherwise, one of the risks is that AT is trying to comply with an RLTP process rather than have its own view of the world that all those other inputs in fact have. So I think we need a touch point that says what AT thinks is the priorities given its understanding of the AT network. So at least you can start to see what you're giving away or adding to through the RLTP process.
Yes, it's a little bit, we seem to be rather late to all of this process.
I think it's there. We just haven't separated it out. I mean, the AT team is working with multiple processes at the moment, and I think what we need to do as a committee is ask for the AT view of what's a priority for its networks.
I think it's a fair point though, Madam Chair. We do need to get this conversation plan sorted out so we know who's endorsing what to who.
Yes.
And how that's going to work, and we really have to nail that for you quickly.
Could I just also understand what is the role when the Regional Land Transport Program is subject to public consultation in a way that many of these other processes are not? Some of them are, but some are not, and some are part of a much, much bigger discussion. So what is our proposal around public consultation, and are we going early with that so that we can properly be informed from a iwi and Auckland public perspective as to what they expect to be in the Regional Land Transport Plan by way of objectives and also by way of projects?
Yes. In terms of early, the council's indicated that their consultation time is going to be, they think, mid-February to mid-March. I would recommend that we align our consultation period with the council's consultation, in particular because they'll be consulting on a revised regional fuel tax proposal. And as I said, that forms a large part of the Auckland Transport Program. So it would make sense to be out in the public with the same story, with the same messages at that time. So I'd recommend that. And that's a full consultation. I think last time in the RTP we may have had a shortened consultation of 2 or 3 weeks. It would normally be 4 weeks, I think. The other thing that I would point out is that...
So I just want to be clear. So you're saying we develop a program before we consult. We don't actually get any view from the public as we are shaping up the Regional Land Transport Program.
Yeah, if I could add that second process, Madam Chair, there is a requirement for the Regional Transport Committee to undertake a review of the current RLTP, and that has to be done in the period from January next year to June next year. And my recommendation would be that we seek the views of stakeholders as part of that process and undertake a review in the early January, February period, just before the draft RLTP is sort of finalised for consultation. So that provides an initial opportunity to get input from stakeholders in the process, but then you would actually go out and in terms of full public consultation, do that mid-February to mid-March.
Okay, other questions and comments from the board, please?
Madam Chair, I think that we need to think carefully about that consultation process because as it's been said, it's what council decides to fund through the regional fuel tax will largely determine what AT can afford to do or will be funded to do. And therefore that consultation process this time round, I'm predicting, will have to express some pretty clear-cut trade-offs, in that consultation process. And it's not just consultation for the RLTP, it's also for the regional fuel tax. So we need to think about when this comes together and we see ATAP and we see the GPS, we're going to have to make explicitly clear what the trade-offs are to support ATAP, for example, against other priorities that the council or we may have, because otherwise nothing will, it'll all be bespoke, I would think. Hamish.
I think it's also worth observing in this context that actually, in terms of the Auckland Transport Program, and probably more widely, we're only going to be dealing with a small amount of variation well, at least that's the way it's shaping up, unless there's an appetite to radically restructure our program. The amount of unallocated funding that we're looking at is currently in the order of about $500 million, and it occurs very late in the program. So actually much of our program is already reasonably committed. So actually the ability to shape it, particularly in a public consultation phase, is really going to be around the edges, and it's the new projects that may be brought into the program later on in the piece. So I think much of our discussion is actually going to be about, well, here's the shape of the program and some of the choices that we're making towards the end. The one element of that that's probably worth noting is some of the challenges around the operating budget I suspect we may see in terms of COVID, particularly in the shorter term. But yeah, most of our CapEx, assuming there isn't a great deal of appetite, and incorporating the desire to see a strong emphasis on renewals is well underway. It's in train. So the actual discretionary elements are relatively modest.
I guess my question would be is that there's almost a gravitational pull back to how we're investing money when we go through these processes. I guess I'd like to test to what extent we are going to open a discussion with the public around policy levers and what the RTC's kind of appetite for that is in this context.
You're referring to road pricing, for example, of charging for parking, that kind of thing, or are you talking about something else?
No, I'm talking about those sorts of things, Madam Chair. I also would be referring to things like, and I'll lead with my chin on this one, but things like the level of fines for things like speeding, the use of alkalox on vehicles, all those sorts of things, which typically my sense is we're not getting a lot of traction. And it's whether the RLTP consultation process and development of the RLTP is the appropriate place to be testing that.
Yeah, safety is certainly one lens for that, and so is climate change. There are things we're not doing that we could be doing to advance those gains. And in fact, without taking steps like that, you're not going to get there, either towards Vision Zero or anything like climate change. So it would be reasonably straightforward to frame those questions as to, well, do we take a step or not?
They're very good questions, and my question back to the executive is, if not the RLTP, then where? Because if we understand, as the expert transport agency for Auckland, if we understand the levers that work and the levers which do not work so well, and the levers that work are not within our mandate or ability to put in place, then where do we actually have the conversation that says, if we're trying to achieve an integrated transport outcome for Auckland, which everybody agrees on what the outcome is, where do we do that? Do we have some other document apart from the Regional Land Transport Program to do that, where the public can engage with it? So what's the answer to that question?
So I think looking around the table here, Madam Chair, the answer is no. So this looks like a prized opportunity.
Well, I think the public of Auckland deserve a real engagement on these issues. There's obviously a huge amount of interest and very varying views. There's a wide spectrum of views, and it'd be good to have something where we could have the debate. It would really help the council as well with its long-term plan.
I think particularly in the context, if there's going to be financial constraint on investing in infrastructure to bring around change, you have to pull other levers. So it's actually a perfect setting.
Just be clear what the RTP can actually deliver and what might need to be delivered in another forum.
or by others.
Is the RLTP supposed to articulate the policy?
Not really, it's the financial, program.
Is there anything that stops us raising wider issues and how effective they could be at achieving our outcomes?
We're definitely not prohibited.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, look, I would think that the RLTP is a perfect place for that. To me, that we need to look at the range of levers that are appropriate. And one end of the levers is the big investment, but as you said, the money's going to be tight. But the other end, and probably in some cases more effective, are those policy levers. And even if the RLTP is more of an advocacy piece, given that the levers actually sit on the government side, even if it simply raises those, at least if they're in the story, that the narrative of the RLTP, they're communicating a full package to the public of Auckland.
Okay. That's been a helpful discussion. Any other comments on the RLTP program? Right. So if I can just summarise that the board does wish to see and be able to, as in its RTC role, to be able to, I would suggest approve the prioritisation objectives which are being used, because obviously we want them to be used in all settings, whether it's ATAP, the regional fuel tax, or the long-term plan that the council's preparing, and that would be very, and also ideally Waka Kotahi and Kiwi Rail, who have got their own ability just to bring projects in to the regional land transport program. It would be good if we were all singing to the same song sheet in terms of the objectives and the prioritisation process, even if there are slightly different folk involved with some of that. We're also keen to see the regional land transport program used to identify the key levers that will achieve the objectives, whether or not they're in the control of Auckland Transport and Auckland Council. And we will obviously we want to get engaged with the public as soon as possible, again in congruence with any related consultation programs that the council is running in this area. But in particular, we want to get to the public before everything is written in ink. So that's so that there is a proper engagement with how we're going and where we need to go next. We've got a couple of recommendations just that we basically note. The program, which I think is quite reasonable, and I think that it will be it will be helpful for us to again understand very early what the Waka Kotahi program is, because it is part of an integrated transport program for the region, and we want to understand if there are any incongruences between our objectives and what their program is. And we, of course, are now in a transparent way hearing directly from Kiwi Rail as to what their program is likely to be, some of which will have implications for the AT operating budget in particular, but also for our capital budget. So it's good that we can welcome Perry to give us an early sort of line of sight on that. So we've got those two recommendations. Does the board agree with, the Regional Transport Committee agree with those? Yes.
Yes.
You can see that. So if we could now turn to you, Perry.
And sorry, Adrian, I have to go because I've got another meeting I have to get to.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary Jane, for your contribution. Let's now move to Perry. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for inviting Kiwi Rail to this forum here in this committee. It is a pleasure and a privilege to be with you, especially as rail is a key component of the transport system here for Auckland. The presentation I've put in is to give RTC an overview of what the RNIP is trying to do and how the RNIP joins in with RLTP. Page 25 of the pack. Agenda, go through a strategic framework, the process for alignment with RLTP, bring you up to speed with the timeline we are working on, and the last agenda item here it will be a high-level program of the rail investment. Through the future of rail review, there were a few issues that were identified. The key main one was a short-term funding decision to be made, and how it led to short-term investment on a long life assets base that KiwiRail has. It also isolates the road and rail infrastructure, and as a result, the transport system wasn't working. We needed to have some substantial changes to the existing planning and funding frameworks, and that's what the future of rail has concluded. There are three main products of the review. The first one being a draft rail plan, the GPS including rail, and also changing the legislative parts. Page 27. KiwiRail has got a plan in terms of a network, which is having a reliable and resilient network. And there are two areas there. The first one is investing in the national rail network, which is mainly for freight, but also working with the metropolitan areas, which is Auckland and Wellington, to ensure that there is growth in these large cities here. The next page, 28, there's a lot of words in here, but the key one is KiwiRail will need to develop a 3- and 10-year plan and develop the RNIP, an investment plan. And the RNIP will need to be aligned to Auckland Transport is doing here in Auckland, because the freight part will be separated from the metropolitan, and the metropolitan will be part of the public transport activity class in the NLTF. Sorry. By incorporating the rapid transit funding and the metro rail funding into the PT activity class, it gives NZTA the flexibility to work with the local government to plan and deliver an appropriate investment plan as urban areas grow. Page 29. Page 29 is an extract of the land transport legislation. So section 22A talks about KiwiRail must prepare the first program to take effect from July 2021. Sections 22C and 22G talks about the NZTA must advise on the rail network investment program and on rail activities to be funded. Section 22B says that the minister must decide whether to approve the rail network investment. And section 22F allows the minister to approve the funding. Section 22H stipulates that KiwiRail needs to follow specified procurement procedures, which is already in place. And section 105A talks about KiwiRail's representation on the regional transport committees, which is what we are doing here today. Go to slide 30. For KiwiRail in the metro area, KiwiRail seeks direction from Auckland's RPTP, which is the Regional Public Transport Plan, because this sets what the direction Auckland is taking in terms of public transport. So this starts to start the process for KiwiRail, and knowing what the level of service is, to some extent, or the requirements is, we can then start to work on our maintenance and renewals and all our improvement projects. We have our view in terms of what is needed, but then we also consult with Auckland Transport, and that's where we've got all the alignment meetings with ETAP. We have a view, Auckland Transport has a view, we bring these views together and we align on our programs there. Once we have a draft RNIP, we provide through ETAP initially what the plan is, and that allows Auckland Transport to start the RLTP process. And then there is a consultation on the RLTP. And then there's that approval by the ARTC, but at the same time, the ARNIP is following its own pathway, like a orange box. NZTA has a very similar process for the RLTP and the ARNIP, and the NZTA board approves the NLTP, whereas the minister approves the ARNIP and any funding for it. Go to the next page, which is a bit of a timeline. So in July, we had legislation put into place, and so we are now working on drafting our in October. But the key overlap with RLTP here is that January to April timeframe, when we need to be working together and making sure that and here the plans are aligned. Final ARNIP will be approved in July 2021. Next page, 32. So the ARNIP in the metro has got two components. As I mentioned, we've got the maintenance and the renewals, and that will be managed through the network access agreements. But we've also got the capital projects, which is, as I've said, which is developed with Auckland Transport and relies heavily on the RPTP. Before I move on to the next two slides, were there any questions on the ARNIP process?
Board, any questions on the Rail National Infrastructure Plan?
Could I just go back to slide 30 on board books, draft RNITP. From the Auckland perspective, starts with Auckland's Regional Public Transport Plan, which is already sort of my mental model was that was subservient to the RLTP, but this suggests that it has given the sort of redeveloped approach from KiwiRail, it may have even more significance, and perhaps there is some independence around the RPTP that actually tries to establish the direction for public transport in Auckland as a starting point rather than an end point of all these other TPs we have to deal with.
I think on that point, there's a degree of
Circularity.
Yeah, there's a flow. Hopefully virtuous, but yes, we developed the RPTP in light of the funding available in the RLTP, and then that shapes our future thinking about direction, and we build on them with the new RLTP space, and then we'll update the RPTP with a look further into the future and the development of the public transport program. So yeah, they are kind of iterating around each other with a fair bit of alignment.
So, okay. Other questions about the National Land Transport? Sorry, the National Rail Plan. Just what I wanted to understand, Perry, was, is it anticipated that most of the funding for it will come directly through the Crown rather than through the National Land Transport Program?
We've got to, from my understanding, there are two buckets, if you want. One will come directly from Crown, and this will address the non-metro areas, which is mainly for freight. And then anything that's got to do with the metro areas will be coming through the NLTF, through the public transport activity class.
Okay, so what's the a lot of the costs that come through the KiwiRail investment in Auckland will essentially go into the access agreement. Am I correct?
Yes, this is my understanding, Madam Chair.
So is the process to optimise your investment how do you consult and ensure that you have an affordable proposition in terms of the Regional Land Transport Program?
I guess Madam Chair, the key activity which is critical in us coming up with the RNIP is the processes we've seen in ATAP, for example, where KiwiRail and Auckland Transport and ZTA and others come in and talk about the different projects. And there's always a question of affordability, which we are grappling with. So from my point of view, the ATAP process or its successor in the future, and the GPS, as Mark was saying, is where the initial thinking and the initial testing of a funding, available funding is done. Once there is reasonable alignment and agreement on it, the RNIP will then follow its separate course, but in parallel with the RLTP, knowing that the two plans are aligned.
Okay, so ATAP is not a statutory process and is not subject to public consultation in the way that the Regional Land Transport Program is. So there's obviously a need to ensure there's really good alignment with the Regional Land Transport Program process.
Correct, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions?
No, it's good. Madam Chair, it's good to have this presentation, have KiwiRail as part of this committee. I think one of the things we need to look to here is that I think it's almost inevitable that upgrade of the maintenance and renewal of the Auckland Metro network is going to lead to increased access charges, which is an operational cost, which is where we struggle for money. And so we need to be consciously forecasting what that might be when we're doing the RLTP and feeding into ATAP. If we're silent about it, we'll leave a big hole.
Correct. Well, yes, and I'll have a discussion about this more broadly at our next board meeting. Okay, any other last comments? So thank you for that, Perry, and welcome again to the committee. We will look forward to seeing you again, and more than twice a year. We'll be having more meetings of this committee, particularly as we are in this 3-year program of getting a new regional land transport program adopted by I think it's June of next year. And of course, it's great that you're a statutory member of this committee, and the other huge input, Waka Kotahi, as I understand it, are not a statutory member of the RTC.
Non-voting.
Oh, okay, they are. Right, so they just are not here today?
No.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. Are there any other matters that anyone wants to discuss with respect to the Regional Transport Committee? That concludes our agenda then, and we will wrap up this meeting. The meeting is now closed. Thank you for your attendance.
Thank you.
Thank you.